Hello, and thank you once again for joining me today. The English language, linguistically, has words sometimes that don't necessarily reflect the meaning that they need to reflect. Today I want to speak to you about 3 words that encompass the entire human being and everything that we live for. They're words that you long to hear from your mother, your father, your children, people around you, your friends. These words touch the heart of every living person. It is something that we can't live without. The words are simply, I love you. Everybody needs to hear this, and it needs to be heard, of course, with sincerity, and of course love is an action. It has to be followed up by actions. It's not just a word. But in other languages, there are multiple meanings for the word love, for all different circumstances that we don't necessarily have in the English language. Today I want to examine those words in detail and find out how there are so many different kinds of love. Let's take a look at that. The Bible tells us in John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." The Bible is primarily a book about love, a book about truth, a book about faith, a book about history, but also a book about righteous correction. And that is where people somehow seem to get lost and say, it's not a book about love. You see, righteous correction is absolutely needed if you love somebody. You need to be able to correct them so that they can do things in a correct manner if they're doing something that's going to hurt them or doing something that's not good for them. And it is absolutely 100% love if that correction is done in a righteous manner. Let's see a verse about that. Jesus tells us in the book of John 14, verse 15, he says this, "If ye love me, keep my commandments." Jesus exemplified exactly what love is meant to be. He was unconditional in his love, his forgiveness, but of course in his righteous correction of the Pharisees and the scribes and the priests who were not living their lives according to the Bible. They were living their lives the way they wanted to live their lives, but that wasn't in accordance with God's word. Mind you, they would say that they were, but Christ knew that they weren't. Now, I'm saying to you that that is a form of love. Even though some might consider that tough love, but you still need to bring people back from error. So that is a form of love because God is love. Let's look at another verse. The Bible tells us about Jesus when he was on the cross, even how he loved upon the cross. In John 19, chapter 25, it says this, "Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Cleophas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by, whom he loved, he said unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. And in verse 27, then said he to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour that disciple took her unto his own home." Jesus was showing how much he loved his mother by organizing things for her after he would be crucified on the cross and rise again and ascend back into heaven. He was making sure that his earthly mother Mary was taken care of. It says he loved his mother and he loved his disciple. You see, under sufferance can we love? Because Christ showed us a great example of love through immense pain and endurance of agony. He showed great love. He even showed great love to the thief on the cross. The Bible tells us in Luke chapter 23, verse 42, "And he said unto Jesus," this is the thief on the cross, "Remember me when thou comest into thy kingdom." Verse 43, and Jesus said unto him, Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise. In the Greek language, there are several words for love. In the English language, we just have one word, love. Now, sometimes people use other things like affection or passionate or things like that. In the Hebrew, there's only one word for love as well. But let's have a look at the Greek ones. What the Greek actually has 7 different kinds, they say. It is this, and that's agape love, which is a love that is unconditional, a love that you have for God. And then there's a pragma, which is a committed, compassionate love. And then there's a philautia, if I'm saying that correctly, which is a love of self. Now, let's be very careful when we say about loving ourselves, because it's healthy to have a love for yourself, to look after yourself, take care of yourself. That is very, very important. But if that's overdone, it becomes a problem. So be careful for that one. And then there's a storge, which is a family or a type of love. And then there's what they call a ludus love, which is a playful kind of a love that children might have for each other. And then there's a philo love, which is an intimate friendship. And then there's a eros love, which God designed between a man and a woman after marriage. Those are the different ones that are listed there today. Some say there's 11 words in the Arabic language. I don't know all those. Just like the Greek ones are hard to pronounce and get to know. But let's have a look at this other one. Okay, the Sanskrit, which is a classical language that's in the Southeastern Asia, it has 96 words for love. That would be very difficult to know which one, wouldn't it? Let's have a look at how many times the word love appears in the King James Bible. It is 310 times. 131 of those are in the Old Testament, and 179 of those are in the New Testament. Jesus loved his family so much. It was an example that we have to follow. Love our family. We read in the book of Acts in chapter 1, verse 14, that Jesus was with his family, with the disciples. It says here, these all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women and Mary, the mother of Jesus, and with his brethren. We know that Jesus loved the disciples, and in Matthew 11:11 it tells us how much he loved John the Baptist. Let's read that. Jesus says here, Verily I say unto you, among them that are born of women here hath not seen a greater than John the Baptist. Notwithstanding, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. Jesus is giving you an insight to how much he loved John the Baptist, but he's also giving you an insight into heaven and the glory that is provided by God and the love that is provided by God for us here on earth. We also read of Jesus having love for those that were the most outcast in society. We read of the publican Zacchaeus up in the tree wanting to see Jesus, wanting to get right. We read about the woman at the well who was in adultery. She'd been married multiple times. Jesus offered them love. He offered them righteous correction. What a beautiful thing it is that those people could see the love of Christ through that correction. In the book of John, chapter 13, we read how Jesus showed his love by doing an action. And he took the towel and he girded himself and he washed the disciples' feet. That was love in action. It wasn't just words. Christ wanted to show that his love was sincere. His care for them was sincere. You see, in those days, shoes weren't common. People were walking those rough roads and stones and pebbles, and the feet became very hard and very tough, and of course they got very dirty. And to have your feet washed by somebody was a great privilege. It was a great honour. And Christ showed them by example how much he loved them. The Bible tells us in John chapter 13, verse 4, it says this, he riseth from supper, and laid aside his garments, and took a towel, and girded himself. After that he poureth the water into a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded. I'd like to share with you today a story. Some years ago, I had the privilege to work on an award-winning documentary about a prisoner of war during the Second World War. And this man was captured, and he was sent to work on the Thai-Burma Railway. Now, that was often referred to as the Railway of Death, the Railway of Despair. And if you went there, chances are that you wouldn't survive. There was just too many problems there. And they say loads and loads of people, 12,000 people, that was soldiers and civilians and other people, died during the making of that railway, and a lot of them were prisoners of war. But the particular man that the documentary focused on was a man who actually survived through all that despair and suffering and sorrow that brought about that railway. Anyway, so I was working on this documentary, and I did not know much at all about the Second World War. We'd learnt briefly some things in school, but it was I was born after that, of course, and I guess we sometimes don't understand the complications and the things that happen in war, and these prisoners were returning home from being prisoners of war, and the Japanese had been defeated, which for them was a disaster, because they were so proud, the Japanese soldiers. They used to sacrifice themselves in aeroplanes, kamikaze, and all kinds of things. So he was a sensitive type of a man, and he'd seen both of the emotions. He'd seen the Japanese falling on their swords, and he'd seen the prisoners of war going home and having to deal with all the things they'd seen during the war, and all the suffering and all the hurt and all the pain. I want to tell you, there are no winners in war, because people always have some kind of heartache attached to that. Anyway, so this man, he came back to Australia, and he spent the next 40 years of his life trying to reconcile the Australian people, the Australian soldiers, with the Japanese. He believed that it was possible to heal that broken bond that was there. He believed that the Japanese people really did not want war. They really did not want to suffer. There were some there that did, but the majority of people in the country, which is generally the case, don't want war. Because war means suffering, it means poverty, it means lack of food, lack of medicine, it means all kinds of things. So he'd seen both sides of it, so he set about for 40 years to try and make a difference between the Japanese people and the Australian people, and he did this, and the documentary focused upon his life and the things that he did and how he managed to do it. And he had great success in bringing many Japanese families and soldiers together and having forgiveness. And he said an interesting thing. He said that his passion was, because it was called the Railway of Death, the Railway of Despair, he called his mission the Railroad of Love. Because love was the only way forward for humanity. Because if you hold on to those griefs, if you hold on to that pain, if you hold on to that agony, then it eats you up. And people need to be loved. And even today, we see our men and women and our soldiers returning from the battlefield and feeling unloved. You must reach out and tell them how much they're loved. They've seen so much suffering, so much pain, so much anguish, that they need to know that there is a greater love, there is a greater purpose, there is a greater meaning, and it is coming from the Heavenly Father, because God is love. But sometimes that can all be lost in the process of war. But let's never let that happen. Let's try and keep our eyes firmly fixed upon the Lord, who says, I offer you hope, I offer you peace, I offer you a new life. And that's what is needed most of the time, is a new life, a new beginning, a new hope. And the hope is Christ. Let's look at another verse. The Bible tells us in the book of Jeremiah, chapter 17, verse 7, "Blessed is the man that trusteth in the Lord, and whose hope the Lord is." Now, as I said before, in the English language we only have the one word love, but there are many occasions where love is used as an applicable word for different things. People say, I love a certain kind of a food. I love having pizza, or I love having some kind of food. It's not uncommon to hear that. And then you have people say, oh, I love this football team, this is the team I've followed all my life. That's a different kind of love again, isn't it? And then there's the kind of love that you have for your relatives. Hope you do, you should. And you need to express a love to them, especially if you want to be a testimony for Christ and they're not saved. You need to be a testimony. You need to keep telling them about Christ, but you need to be a testimony as well. And then there's the kind of love you have for your children, your sons and your daughters, which is a different kind of love to the love that you have for your wife. You have that's a different kind of love again, but there's still only this one word, which is love. There's a love that people have for art, or a love for music. I have a love for music. I've loved music all my life. I even once wrote a song called My Love for the Music, because that was my passion. And now all those different kinds of loves, but it's just one word, but they are different in all their things. But now let's look at what is known as agape love, which is God's love, which doesn't have conditions attached to it. It is a love that God offers you simply by coming to Him. And that's just an incredible thing. And as human beings, we struggle. But I want to present you with the one that we struggle the most with. Now, Christ said this. He said, love them that hate you. Love your enemies. Oh. As a human being, that is probably the hardest thing for anyone to ever have to do. You've got to love people that hate you. You've got to love people that say terrible things about you. You've got to love people that is hard. But it's not impossible, because if you don't, what happens is you become bitter in life. And that bitterness affects you. It doesn't affect someone else. It actually affects you. So the best thing, advice I can give you is let it go. Don't worry about it. Move on. Because if you harbour bitterness and you harbour hatred, it keeps you away from God. But if you offer forgiveness, it brings you closer to God, because that is God's heart. God's heart is based on forgiveness and love. And as a Christian, if we can do that, that is the greatest testimony we can have to anybody, anywhere, anytime, is just to have forgiveness. That's the great words of Christ. The Bible tells us in Matthew chapter 5, verse 43, Jesus says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbour and hate thine enemy." Verse 44, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." It's very clear that Christ is teaching us that we must forgive, we must pray for them, we must be a testimony, we must be a witness to those who are against us. In closing today, I want to tell you that there are things that you should not fall in love with. Don't fall in love with the world. Don't fall in love with the world's entertainment. Don't fall in love with the world's music. Don't fall in love with the world's standard. Don't fall in love with the cursing and blasphemy of God. Don't fall in love with people or friends who do not love God. Do not fall in love with people whose whole being is about collecting possessions and loving money. Don't fall in love with those things. because those things will drive you away from God. And when people are driven away from God, they're away from a true love. They're away from true hope. They're away from true peace. They're away from God, and they are in a dark place. I pray that's not you today. I pray you're not in a dark place. I pray that you're in a place where you have friends who love God, not friends who just love going out and having fun. There's nothing wrong with having fun, but do it the right way. Don't fall into bad habits. Don't fall into alcohol. Don't fall into drugs. Don't fall into fornication. Those things will ruin your life. So many people I know have gone down that path, and some have realised their error and come back, and some haven't. The greatest life you can have is a life for Christ, because Christ's love is unconditional. If you're down and out, He's the only one who can bring you back. God is love, but it's righteous, correctional love. The Bible tells us that He's willing that none should perish. That's you, that's me. By simply coming to Christ, confessing our sins, and asking Christ to be in our heart, in our life, with all sincerity, with all love, you can be a part of that heavenly kingdom. You can have that hope, that truth, that love that God offers. Unconditional love that no man could ever offer you is available to you, to me, every man, woman and child in this world. Remember those words? I love you. God says that every day when you wake up. I love you. Come back to me. God bless. Bye for now.